Good morning to many of you, and good afternoon to the others. My name is Peter Rumsey, and I'm the founder of the Stanford Building Decarbonization Learning Accelerator. And we are very honored and pleased to welcome Mark Jacobson as our webinar speaker today. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Stanford BDLA, we're a project of Stanford to try to make building decarbonization teaching tools available to colleges and universities throughout the US and the world. We have several hundred users representing well over 100 universities that are now participants and collaborators in this effort. And we welcome you to not only participate in this webinar, but after the webinar, go to our website, bdla.stanford.edu, and look at the resources that we've put together, which include everything from slide decks, exercises, case studies, and videos on the topic of building decarbonization that we welcome you to use in your course as you see fit. So let me introduce Mark. And Mark, thank you for joining us today. I think Mark is very busy and has got a lot going on, so it's an honor to have you here. Mark is the director of the Atmospheric Energy Program and a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford. He's also senior fellow of the Woods Institute for Environment and of the Precourt Institute for Energy, both of Stanford University. His career focuses on better understanding air pollution and global warming problems and developing clean, renewable energy solutions for them. He's published over 6 books, including his latest, which I've read and thoroughly enjoyed, called No Miracles Needed. And he's written over 185 journal articles. He served as an expert witness in the first U.S. constitutional climate trial to win. It was Held versus Montana. And that's quite an exciting win. If you don't know about that, I would recommend looking that up. That just occurred this last summer. His work in the is the scientific basis for the energy portion of the U.S. Green New Deal and laws to go to 100% renewable energy worldwide. Renewable energy is the key to unlocking full decarbonization, in addition to building efficiency and building electrification. So what Mark is going to talk to us about today is going to be very important part of building decarbonization. And some of the things that I've learned from Mark are that 11% of US energy goes to refining and transporting and extracting fossil fuels. And so there's lots of other just surprising things that Mark is going to share with us today. Thank you, Mark, for making the time. And just as a little ground rule, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A, and we'll ask those at the end of his talk, or you can also raise your hand at the end of the talk, and we will get to as many of those as possible. Thank you, Mark, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Peter. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully you can see this. I'm going to talk about transitioning California and the world to just clean renewable energy and storage for all purposes. So I'm going to talk not only about buildings, but also other energy sectors. And I'll just preface this as yesterday and the day before, California's main grid, which is the CAISO grid, was over 100% renewables for the 106th and 107th time this year for part of the day. Which I'll show you some data on that later in the talk. But so I'm going to talk first about global. I have several issues I want to talk about, and a lot of stuff will be new. But the first thing is that why am I interested in this? I'm interested from an air pollution, climate, and energy security point of view. Worldwide, there are almost 7.5 million people dying from air pollution each year, based on statistical cost of life and morbidity. That's on the order of $30 trillion per year today. And global warming itself is expected to cost on the order of $30 trillion by 2050, but could be even faster due to the fast rise in temperatures that are occurring recently. And energy security is the third problem that I'm trying to address. And not only fossil fuels are limited resources, they will run out at some point, and that will result in energy well, social, political, and economic instability. There are other types of energy insecurity problems. The solutions that we've been proposing since 2009 is to basically electrify all energy as much as possible, and then provide the electricity with just wind, water, and solar. And so the main sectors are transportation, buildings, industry, and electricity. And so for transportation, we go primarily to battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. The hydrogen fuel cell would be for long distance heavy transport, like long distance aircraft, long distance ships, for example, but pretty much everything else battery electric. For buildings, electric heat pumps for air heating, air conditioning, water heating, clothes drying, even washing machines and dishwashers can use electric heat pumps, use electric induction cooktops. They use about 60% less energy than gas to cook the same food. Heat pumps use about 75% less energy than gas for combustion, for heating. Use LED lights, insulation, more energy efficiency. So you probably all know about these things. Industry, we would electrify industry as much as possible. Instead of using combustion for high temperature heat, we'd use arc furnaces, induction furnaces, resistance furnaces, dielectric heaters, electron beam heaters, and heat pumps for low to high temperature heat. And we'll also talk about new technology fire bricks that would be for industrial heat storage, which can actually replace all of those technologies. And then we will provide all the electricity and some direct heat with just wind, onshore and offshore wind, solar photovoltaics on rooftops and in power plants, concentrated solar power, geothermal electricity, and there'll be some geothermal heat, hydroelectric power, and small amounts of tidal wave power, and some solar heat as well. We'll need storage, of course, and the largest type of storage worldwide today is hydroelectric dams. The second largest are pumped hydroelectric storage. And batteries, though, are growing, and there's pretty much most new storage going in today are batteries. But there are other types of storage that exist: concentrated solar power storage, flywheels, compressed air storage, gravitational storage with solid masses, and even using some hydrogen in a fuel cell to regenerate electricity. That can be a storage option for electricity. For heating, cooling, this is for buildings in particular. A lot of these are for district heating and cooling, but water tanks, of course, are the most common types of hot and cold storage worldwide. They can be used either in individual buildings or for district heating systems. Ice storage. Stanford used to have a big ice cube under a building to serve the university. When the electricity price was low at night, the electricity was used to produce ice, and then during the day, water was run through coils in the ice to cool it down, and it was sent to buildings to reduce air conditioning use in buildings. But then district heating for communities, there's borehole storage, water pit storage, aquifer storage, then storage in building materials, of course, and then fire bricks, which I'll talk about in a little bit, for industry. And then there's also hydrogen storage for non-grid purposes, such as ammonia production, steel production, and long-distance transport. So let me just summarize these new plans that we developed for 149 countries, which represent 99.75% of all world emissions. These are is it possible to transition all these countries? So we developed roadmaps for each one of the 149 countries, and then divided the countries into 29 world regions. And some, like a lot of these are island regions like New Zealand or Japan or Taiwan, and some are isolated like South Korea as well. And then we did grid stability analyses in each of these regions encompassing the 149 countries. And that's what I'll talk about the results. So just to give you some overall statistics, the raw data come from energy data for 2020 come from the International Energy Agency. So the annual average end use power demand among all these countries is 12.6 terawatts in 2020. That's expected to grow to 18.9 terawatts in 2050. But if we electrify all energy and provide the electricity with wind, water, solar, that goes down by 54% due to five factors mainly. The efficiency of battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles over internal combustion engine vehicles, the efficiency of electrified industry, the efficiency of heat pumps for buildings instead of combustion heating, eliminating, as Peter mentioned, almost 11% of all energy worldwide is used just to mine, transport, and refine fossil fuels and uranium. So we get rid of all that energy requirements, and then we'll try to squeeze end-use energy efficiency improvements and reducing energy use beyond what's expected in a business as usual case of about 6.6%. So that adds up to 54.4%. So if we look on a timeline from 2022 to 2050, we see if we don't do anything, we go along the top line where we get to 18.9 terawatts in 2050. But if we electrify all energy and provide the electricity, and there's some heat with wind, water, solar, we go down those 5 shades of colors for those 5 reasons I mentioned to the 100% wind, water, solar line. And that's what we need to match with just wind, water, and solar. And this shows a transition of 80% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And it used to be thought like 2 years ago that, well, we have some time to avoid 1.5 degrees warming because the average warming so far up to a couple of years ago was about 1.2 degrees. But last year, the warming increased to 1.35 to 1.48 degrees, depending on the data set you look at. And the first 6 months of this year, plus last 6 months of last year, it's up to 1.64 degrees. Well, anyway, you have to look at a long-term average, but still it's closer to 1.5 than it used to be. So we don't have as much time. Plus, if we can get 80% transition by 2030, it's certainly possible to get 100% by 2035. And because we have right now about 95 to 97% of the technologies we need. And so the ones we don't have are like long distance aircraft and ships. So this shows the same end point in 2050, but 100% transition by 2035. So that should really be the goal, because if we're trying to eliminate air pollution simultaneously, air pollution causes 7.5 million premature deaths each year. And so we need to address that immediately, and climate is becoming a more and more urgent problem. Well, okay, so in the scenarios averaged over the 149 countries, this shows the mix worldwide of the wind, water, solar technologies. So it'd be 35% onshore wind, 14% offshore wind, et cetera. 5% hydro, which all exist today. And it shows also for the US and for Europe. And this again is across all energy sectors. It's not just electricity. And so there's a different mix for different countries and regions. So in the US, and there's also multiple options. This is not the only solution. There are many solutions actually. But this just shows one set of solutions. But I would say the hydro in these cases all exist today. We did not add any new hydro. So in Europe, 7.35%, that all exists. In the US, that almost 2% hydro for all energy, that all exists. Now, the other ones don't exist largely, but there's a certain amount of this is existing onshore wind or offshore wind, and a certain amount of rooftop PV, et cetera. In terms of grid stability, as I mentioned, we did grid stability analyses in each of 29 world regions. Here's one for South Korea. 3 years, we looked every 30 seconds for 3 years. And we model the winds and solar radiation fields with a climate model that predicts the winds and solar radiation in 2050, in this case to 2052, in each part of the world. And so we have input supply of electricity on a very fine resolution. We also have building heat demand because we model the outdoor temperatures in each location, each grid cell of a model, and we try to fix the indoor temperature to a desired set point temperature. So every 30 seconds, we can calculate what's the difference between the outdoor temperature and indoor temperature, and we can estimate basically the energy needed to maintain that indoor temperature, so we can get estimated heat and cold demand every 30 seconds for multiple years. We have the supply of energy. We do have to make assumptions about the frequency of transportation, but we do have data for the present day for other demands like transportation and industry, which we project forward. Anyway, this shows a matching supply with demand every 30 seconds for 3 years in South Korea. The top shows the entire data set every hour. The bottom shows a 100-day period. Every hour you can see finer granularity. So we're able to match energy supply with demand, changes in storage, losses, and shedding. So this is, and we're able to do this everywhere in the world. There's not a single place we found that we cannot match 100% renewable supply with demand and storage. And yeah, there's never a blackout if we do it right. Now, the question is, what's the cost? Okay, we'll get to that here. The capital cost of transitioning in this base case worldwide was about $58 trillion. US about 5.7 trillion, China about 14.6, Europe about 5.1 trillion. So that's really the capital cost of a Green New Deal. But really what's more useful information is what's the annual energy cost in a business as usual versus a wind, water, solar case. So today, energy worldwide costs consumers for all energy, not just electricity, but transportation, buildings, industry, about $11 trillion per year. By 2050, that's expected to go up to 16.5 trillion. Health costs, even in 2050, are expected to be about 34 trillion in a business as usual case. Climate costs about 31 trillion per year. The total social cost, 81 trillion per year. Wind, water, these are all energy related costs. There's additional costs due to non-energy emissions, but we're just focusing on the energy related emissions. With wind, water, solar, you eliminate all energy related emissions. So you eliminate all energy related health costs and climate costs. And because your energy requirements go down 54% and the cost per unit energy goes down another 10 or 15%, you get a 60% lower energy cost per year and a 92% reduction in the social cost. So if we just look at the energy cost difference, 16.5 versus 6.7, so that's about $10 trillion per year difference. So we save $10 trillion per year. We divide the capital cost, 58 trillion, by 10 trillion per year. It's a payback time of about 6 years. So that sounds like a good deal. But so you're really reducing costs substantially. Okay, so how much land would all this take? Well, this is new land in this case. We don't need land for offshore wind, tidal, or wave power. Rooftop PV does not take up new land. Geothermal is small. Hydro, we're not adding any new hydro in these examples. We're just adding new land for utility PV and CSP and solar thermal and some onshore wind. So worldwide, that's about 0.38% of world land for onshore wind. That's spacing between turbines that can be used for multiple purposes, including utility PV. And then PV itself and CSP, it's about 0.13% of land. So that's half of 1% of the world land. In the US, that's about a little over 1%, 1.1%. In Europe, it's about 0.9%. For comparison, in the United States, 30 million acres are used just for corn for ethanol production. That's 1.24% of all US land is used for corn ethanol in the United States. Another 1.3% of land is occupied by the fossil fuel industry. That's for the over a million oil and gas wells, active ones, the 3.2 million abandoned ones, the millions of miles of oil and gas pipelines, the service stations, the storage facilities, the coal mines, you name it, all fossil fuel industry is about 1.3% of US land. So that's 2.5% of US land. We're going down to around 1% for the US, for example. So we think it's a reduction of land requirements. So let me talk about this new technology for industry. And this doesn't have so much application for commercial or residential buildings, although you might think it does because it's heat storage. But for buildings, I'll argue that this is not so useful because there are just other more efficient ways to store heat, or just, for example, just using heat pumps powered by renewable electricity, that would be more efficient. But for industry, this is really useful. So fire bricks are basically kiln bricks. They have the same composition as kiln bricks, which are basically made of the components of clay, so soil. These types of bricks have been around since the Bronze Age, and they're used even today to line kilns. But in one composition, they can store heat to very high temperatures, up to 2,000 degrees. And another composition, they actually insulate the heat storing bricks. So these are basically low cost because they're made of the components of dirt, like made of silica, alumina, magnesia, and chromium, which are all the components of clay in different compositions. They cost about 1/10 the battery cost per kilowatt hour of, in this case, heat versus electricity. And when you heat them up, you heat them with electric resistance heating, different types, and they can stay heated, lose about 1% per day. But the nice thing is when you have a 100% renewable grid, whenever you have extra electricity, you could use them to heat the bricks, store this high temperature heat for a while, and then whenever you need it, you can just blow air through channels in the bricks to provide high temperature heat for industry. So otherwise, if you use arc furnaces, induction furnaces with 100% wind, water, solar, you may need a lot of battery storage for the electricity if you want to run industry 24/7. But if you use these instead, you not only do not need the furnaces, like arc furnaces, induction furnaces, but you don't need the batteries either. You just have these fire bricks, which are cheaper than batteries. And they can replace about 90% of industrial processes, or heat for industrial processes, up to 2,000 degrees in some cases. And so just to give you a summary of these are bricks that store low to high temperature heat for 90% of industry. They use resistive heating from 100% renewable wind, water, solar, electricity. Air is blown through channels in the bricks to allow industry to run 24/7 on this heat. The cost, 1/10 the cost per kilowatt hour is batteries, and they'll eliminate the need for furnaces. And so we ran simulations comparing use of fire bricks with just electricity in arc furnaces, etc. And we found that using the fire bricks reduced the total capital cost of transition by 1.27 trillion, down to 57 trillion. And the levelized cost of electricity by 1.8%. So, and this shows the components of the levelized cost of electricity reduction. In a base case, we had 8.8 cents a kilowatt hour. And then we save some long distance transmission capacity, wind, water, solar generation, reduce battery needs, reduce the use of grid hydrogen fuel cells for electricity storage, even reduce some hot water thermal energy storage and underground thermal energy storage. The fire bricks themselves add cost, that's the green. And we also reduce the grid hydrogen production and storage needed. So there's a loss. It's really a remarkable tool at decarbonizing the industrial sector, because yeah, you just need less equipment and it's so simple. And yeah, these components are really cost effective. I want to talk about another application, which is really interesting. This is carbon capture. So people ask, well, should we be promoting carbon capture? And so we did this analysis across the 149 countries to look at, if we did carbon capture and direct air capture on a large scale, would this actually reduce carbon? Would it reduce costs? What would be the impact? So we ran 4 cases. One is the business as usual case, which is basically what I've talked about already. We also ran a wind, water, solar case, what I've also talked about already, but we added 2 additional cases. One is, instead of using wind, water, solar to replace all business as usual fuels, we added carbon capture equipment to all stationary sources and added direct air capture to take carbon out of the air to account for the emissions of carbon from all mobile and non-stationary sources. And in one case, we use business as usual fuels to power the carbon capture. The other, we use wind, water, solar fuels to power the carbon capture. So there are 4 cases we looked at. And here are some of the assumptions. While in 2050, even with the carbon capture cases, we assumed a decrease of energy demand in 2050 of 6.7% due to end use energy efficiency improvements. So that would occur even if we did or didn't have carbon capture. 9.8% of the remaining 2050 business as usual demand comes from wind, water, solar. 2% comes from nuclear. And those sources are assumed to emit no CO2. And 85% of remaining BAU CO2 emissions are CO2. The efficiency of carbon capture is 80%, whereas the real range is 10 to 80%. And we need 25% more energy with carbon capture, and direct air capture, IPCC estimates 13 to 44%. And we assume all CO2 is stored, although today 82% of all CO2 captured is used for enhanced oil recovery, which releases 40% back to the air. So these are pretty liberal assumptions, I think. Here's some data of carbon capture efficiencies for all sorts of types of projects. They range from 10 to 80% from real world data. We assume the high end at 80%. Okay, so first let's look at the end use power demand in these different cases. In business as usual, it's about 18 terawatts in 2050. With carbon capture, in both cases, that goes up because there's an energy penalty associated with carbon capture and direct air capture. With wind, water, solar, the energy goes down 54% versus business as usual. So first of all, we need more energy with carbon capture than without it. And that's the same with direct air capture. Air pollution costs correspondingly go up, and death rates go up with carbon capture because you're using more energy. In the business as usual case, where the carbon capture is powered by business as usual fuels, it goes up the most. If the carbon capture is powered by wind, water, solar, it goes down slightly versus business as usual, about 6.7%, because that's where there's actually less energy use in the carbon capture case. But with wind, water, solar, those costs go down to zero. In terms of the carbon emissions, again, this assumes 100% of all carbon dioxide is captured and stored underground, which is not. That goes down in the carbon capture cases slightly. Well, actually, relatively, on the order of 30 gigatons a year, but it goes down to zero with wind, water, solar. So if we combine the energy costs, the health costs, and the climate costs, this is what we get. The carbon capture cases, they do reduce compared to business as usual, the $1 trillion per year required. So instead of the social cost from 80 trillion in the business as usual case to about 70 or 60 trillion dollars per year social cost. But wind, water, solar goes down to $7 trillion per year. So we're talking a factor of 10 lower emission rate, or sorry, social cost with wind, water, solar than carbon capture. One more carbon capture thing. So we did an analysis of looking at carbon capture with added to ethanol refineries. There's a proposal by this company to spend $5.6 billion to add carbon capture equipment to 34 ethanol refineries and 2,000 miles of carbon dioxide pipelines across 5 states and store the CO2 underground. The ethanol is used for flex fuel vehicles. And we compare that with spending the same 5.6 billion on building wind turbines to power battery electric vehicles. And we compared, driving a Ford F-150 flex fuel vehicle with a Ford F-150 battery electric vehicle. And just to give you some numbers on the difference between the efficiency of electric vehicles and combustion vehicles, the Ford F-150 electric vehicle, it gets 480 watt hours per mile. That's how much electricity is required. That corresponds to 579 miles per gigajoule of energy. The flex fuel vehicle, it gets 14 miles per gallon. That translates into 157 miles per gigajoule. So the battery electric vehicle goes 3.7 times the distance on the same energy. And if you look at the cost of electricity versus the cost of fuel, the battery electric vehicle owners are saving $26,500 over 15 years if they drive 15,000 miles a year. But the battery electric vehicle costs more upfront. On the other hand, there's a tax credit, and so it's $21,700 upfront. Higher price in 2023. That's actually dropped to about $10,000 difference now. But even with that difference, if you extrapolate these numbers, so we compared this ethanol plan of adding carbon capture to ethanol refineries. The carbon capture again doesn't reduce any of the air pollution from the refineries, and it requires a lot of these 2,000 miles of pipelines. The blue is the tons of, on the left, it's the tons of CO2 avoided. So it's about 8 million tons of CO2 avoided in the ethanol case. But because we're in the electric vehicle case, we're eliminating all tailpipe emissions of the vehicles, and we're eliminating all the rest of the emissions from the ethanol refineries and growing corn, et cetera. So we're actually avoiding 2.4 to 4 times the CO2 emissions if we invest instead in electric vehicles powered by wind. And the costs are just enormous because of the fuel cost savings. So the yellow on the right is the additional cost of the higher cost of the electric vehicle up front. The blue is the initial investment of $5.6 billion in each case. The red is the fuel savings over 30 years. When you just use battery electric vehicles versus flex fuel vehicles, the fuel cost savings. So the net fuel cost savings is $40 to $66 billion over 30 years investing in wind. So basically this ethanol pipeline system is just going to saddle consumers with high costs for decades. And it's, as I mentioned, it takes 30 million acres, 1.24% of all US land area. All right, so let's just now we're going to kind of go to the states and look at, this is where I'll get to California in a second. So how are we doing worldwide with renewable electricity? There are now 14 countries that generate 95 to 100% of all their electricity with wind, water, solar. And these are listed on the left. And many of these are really at 100%, but they're all pretty much dominated by hydropower. And except for the South Georgia Sandwich Islands, they're actually, although I think I didn't put it should be solar and wind. South Georgia oh, no, that's correct. It is hydro and wind, but it's actually number past this number 15, I think is Tokelo, which is about 92%, and that's almost all solar and wind. But on the right are US states, and it's the fraction of the electricity they consume that's produced from July 1st, 2023 to June 30th, 2024 from just wind, water, solar. So we have South Dakota is actually producing 100.6% of the electricity it consumes with just wind and a hydro and a tiny bit of solar. It's almost all wind actually, or it's like 70% or 75% wind, and most of the rest is hydro. Montana's at 80%, Iowa is 79%, Washington State is 72%, Kansas 67%, etc. California is down number 12 at 47%. But 7 of these states are actually dominated by wind, and 3 are dominated by hydro, and California is dominated by solar. Now, but that doesn't illustrate what's really going on in California since March of this year in particular. There's been a remarkable growth of renewables on the grid. So since March 7th, as I mentioned today or yesterday, we were the 107th day of over 100% renewables. And so I'll just show you some examples of what I'm talking about. So each of these figures on the left, it shows the percent, the red line is 100% of demand. And so all those colors are wind, water, solar. So yellow is solar, green is wind, red is geothermal, the light blue is large hydro, and then there's orange, which is small hydro, and the dark blue is batteries. And this I'm showing because, well, you can see it's over 100% renewable wind, water, solar for a few hours. And on the right, by the way, is the absolute amount, the absolute demand, and the absolute supplies. It's the same thing that it's on the left, except one is relative. But this was a day we had a solar eclipse. So notice when there's a dip in solar supply, that's because grid scale solar supply, that's because the sun was blocked, and batteries immediately kicked in to fill in the gaps. And you also note that on the right side, during that time, there was an increase of demand. And that's due to during the eclipse. And that's due to the fact that rooftop solar was not available. Rooftop solar is not on the grid. Rooftop solar was no longer available in a lot of cases. And so people's homes would then draw more grid electricity. So you can see they were tied together. So conversely, the more rooftop solar we have, the lower the grid demand becomes. And I'll show you actually some graphs on that later. But let's look at a few other graphs. So this is a day, Sunday, May 5th. The wind, water, solar met up to 162% of demand for 5 minutes and exceeded demand for almost 10 hours. And even and for a period, solar alone exceeded demand. And so that's actually happened on about 22 days, where solar alone has met 100% of California's grid demand. By the way, so this is the CAISO grid, which is the main grid in California. It serves about 82% of the load. So here's another day where in the 24-hour average, wind, water, solar met 82.3% of demand. So you can see the minimum at night is around 50%. So what we need to do is fill in those white areas. And the other thing is that when you have extra wind, water, solar during the day, what's going on is that, half of that's going into battery storage and the other half is exported out of state. Then the batteries are then kicking in at night. So now we have a record amount of batteries on the grid. It's up to 8.2 gigawatts. And last year at the same time it was about 4 gigawatts. So we doubled the battery capacity on the grid in 1 year. And if we compare to last year, which I'll do, solar went up about 30% and wind went up about 8% compared to last year. And gas went down during the period I'll show it went down about 40%. So here's another day, the maximum peak battery output. This was, well, since then it's gone up to 8.2 gigawatts, but this at the time was 7.8 gigawatts. You can see how the blue is filling up more space. This is June 20th, the maximum peak solar output, 19.4 gigawatts, and maximum daily solar output, 208.8 gigawatt hours per day. This shows the whole time series from March 7th to June 30th, which was a period where there were 98 days out of 116 where we exceeded 100% wind, water, solar on the grid. The red is the peak of each day, goes up to 162%. The green is the 24-hour average wind, water, solar each day. The blue is the 24-hour minimum, and the black is the number of hours per day that the wind, water, solar exceeded demand. This is another time series for the same period, March 7th through June 30th, showing on the top 100% of demand, and this is the daily average wind, water, solar supply as a function of demand. And on the bottom is the same thing, but the absolute amounts. Okay, so this is interesting. This is the comparison of 2024 versus 2023. So 2024 grid demand went down, went by about 1%. And that's because, well, the additional rooftop solar PV that went in mostly in the end of 2024, but also some early 2020, end of 2023, but also some early 2024, that reduced the demand for grid electricity by about 3%. However, temperatures in 2024 are about 3% higher than in 2023. So there's actually more demand for electricity, but there's more rooftop solar to reduce that demand. So that's why we still have a net reduction of demand, even though there's higher temperatures. And that's accounts for all these additional electric cars, et cetera. So total wind, water, solar supply went up about 11%. The solar went up about 30%. Wind this year went up about 8%. Geothermal went down a little bit. Small hydro and large hydro went down, but batteries doubled. Fossil gas, as I mentioned, went down about 40%. And then the next one is the number of hours per day on average over the 116 days that wind, water, solar exceeded demand. So that went up by a factor of 3. And the other statistics I don't have to go into. But a couple more factoids here. So this shows the nameplate capacities of wind, water, solar generators and batteries on the CAISO grid from 2018 to 2024. So the yellow is utility solar, the red is distributed solar, the green is wind, the dark blue is batteries, and then brown is geothermal, and light blue is small hydro. And you can see utility solar and rooftop solar have all been increasing, and wind is actually going up slightly as well, but batteries are really skyrocketing. Okay, so this shows the hourly demand on average over the year. Well, it's really a period from, I think, July 1st to June 30th, crossing over each year. It shows by hour of the day, the change in demand. So you can see 23 to 24, the demand has gone down. That's grid demand. That's because of the increase of rooftop PV. So that's the big benefit of rooftop PV. It's reducing strain on the grid. And that's despite the fact that there are higher temperatures this year than last year. Now in the summer, temperatures went up even higher. And so there were only a few days where we met 100% wind, water, solar after June 30th, which is technically still part of summer. And now it's starting to ramp up again since we're getting closer to autumn. But in the summer, demand goes up quite a bit. And so it makes it harder to meet 100%. So what is needed to obtain 100% wind, water, solar every hour? We need more utility PV and batteries, more rooftop PV and batteries, heat pumps, energy efficiency, offshore wind, which runs 24/7 offshore of California, and it peaks in the summer actually. Shift more hydropower to night and use demand response more effectively. So to summarize, transitioning the world to 100% wind, water, solar creates 28 million more jobs than lost worldwide, requires only about 0.5% of world land for footprint and spacing. We avoid 7 million air pollution deaths per year, slow than reverse global warming. I think we can keep the grid stable throughout the world with 100%. Annual energy costs are 60% less than fossil costs, and annual energy, health, and climate costs are 92% less than with business as usual. With regard to carbon capture and direct air capture, climate policies that propose the use of carbon capture or direct air capture, which is SDACC as synthetic direct air carbon capture, as opposed to natural carbon capture, which is by direct air capture, which is by trees. So speaking specifically to synthetic, to reduce energy-related CO2 will instead increase air pollution, CO2 emissions, energy needs, private energy costs, and social energy costs substantially relative to requiring 100% wind, water, solar. The conclusion applies to any level of carbon removal above zero. Carbon capture and synthetic direct air carbon capture may, in the limit, cause millions of unnecessary air pollution deaths each year and substantial climate damage in the short and long term. As such, policies promoting carbon capture and synthetic direct air carbon capture should be abandoned. And then finally, here's some more information in case you want to look into this more. But thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions.
Well, Mark, thank you as usual. I feel like I get a whole quarter or whole semester's worth of information from one lecture, so I love it. There's been a very active chat and questions going on. There's been a couple questions relating to the topic that a lot of people are thinking about right now, which is energy consumption of data centers, and especially with the surge of AI and everything. And have you had a chance to think about that, or do you have any
Well,
thoughts there?
if yeah, so so the things that are increasing demand on the grid are data centers, Bitcoin mining, more electric vehicles. I mean, we anticipate if you electrify all energy, you're reducing the overall demand by 54%. So let's say we start at 100 units of all energy today, and right now 20% of all energy is electricity. This is end use energy. So if we go take down 54% by going to electricity, wind, water, solar, we're down to 46 units. So basically, we would, if we wanted that all to be electricity, we'd little more than double the current electricity on the grid. So let's say it's up by, two and a, or double, little more than double, like 2.25% or something, or 2.25 times. So we're going to need more electricity if we want to electrify everything. But yeah, so the electrification of vehicles is part of that already. The electrification of AI. Well, what we've seen so far in California is that that hasn't driven up all the electric vehicles, and the AI and data centers haven't driven up the demand. It's really the higher temperatures that have a bigger impact on the demand. It's just like, yeah, you have one day where it's hot, a heat wave. I mean, your demand goes up like 30% right on the grid that day. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that's like the bigger concern. But if you have solar on your roof, like my house, I have solar on my roof, when we have the hottest days of the year. In fact, I looked at this in 2020, the very hottest day of the year. I kept the temperature indoor cool, and I was still a net exporter of electricity back to the grid because the heat pumps are so efficient, they hardly use any energy. So I think that's the key, is electrification of current combustion heating or cooling really makes things more efficient. And the more rooftop solar we have, the less strain on the grid we'll have. So I think we need to, put more solar on rooftops as much as possible to reduce the strain on the grid. That's really the solution. In addition to, you don't want the use of electricity to go out of control, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting thing because that recently there's been discussion that, well, maybe data centers should be coupled with these small modular nuclear reactors. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that. Because these data centers, the new AI ones are going to be, 150 to 100 megawatts per data center.
Yeah, I mean, it's just talk, because there's no commercial small modular nuclear reactor exists, and it's not even expected to have prototypes until after 2030. So if you want to waste time and allow more people to die and more climate damage to occur, just to keep talking about that. And plus the cost of that is expected to be so high, it just wouldn't even, I don't even know how the economics, I mean, small reactors are more expensive per unit energy than large reactors. They have been, that's why we went to large reactors in the first place. So this is just all hype by the nuclear industry to keep them relevant, keep themselves relevant.
Yeah. Great. Very thought-provoking. Lindsay, there's some other Q&A. Lindsay's going to go ahead and take the lead on that.
Okay, yeah. Let me just get rid of that. So we had a question from Kurt. I'm curious to know Mark's perspective on the prospect of utility-operated networked geothermal or thermal energy networks for building decarb as being pilot tested in Framingham, Mass, and encouraged by recently passed CASB 1221.
Well, I'm not sure if is that a district heating system? I mean, geothermal for district heating is good. It's been very successful in many places in Europe. And geothermal heat pumps are very useful. There are companies now that have reduced the cost of ground source heat pumps. I'm not really sure about, I'm not familiar with the specifics of that question, but I think in general, yeah, geothermal heating is really good for buildings. If there's well, definitely for heat pumps for buildings, especially in climates that get really cold or really hot, that's when ground source heat pumps are really useful. But in terms of electricity generation, if that's what they're referring to, you basically need certain temperatures, and you either have nice reservoirs that are shallow, or you use enhanced geothermal when you go deeper. So there's actually some good experimental places where that's actually starting to work. And the question is, what's the cost on the large scale?
And then we have Christopher. How can companies transition their data centers to operate on 100% WWS systems while maintaining reliability and scalability, especially in regions with variable renewable energy availability? I don't know if you want to add anything to what you've already said.
Well, these companies that have big data centers have been doing this since 2007. I think Google did it first in 2007. They built a wind farm in Iowa and moved a data center there. So they've been experimenting with being 24/7, but you don't have to be 24/7. I mean, ideally, that would be nice, but there's no reason you can't just be connected to the grid and work with the grid to make everything more efficient, because sometimes there'll be times when you have extra wind, and if you're isolated from the grid, then you're just wasting that energy. So they don't have to run 24/7. Their data centers don't have to run 24/7 on the renewables. I mean, they could if with a certain amount of storage, but that's not necessary. What they need to do is be in sync with the rest of the grid and the rest of the demands on the grid. And if they're supplying in the annual average enough wind or solar to offset their use, that will be helpful. Because Stanford, for example, Stanford University, it's 100% renewables for electricity, heating, and cooling, but it doesn't match the demand 24 hours a day. It bought 2 big solar farms and has about 10 megawatts on the rooftop. So you add that together, and in the annual average, the university provides 100% of its electricity, heating, and cooling with just solar, in fact. But if they tried to match it 24 hours a day, then it's not necessary in my mind, if you're linked with the rest of the grid.
There is a question from Monica. What are your thoughts on why the DOE and others in the private sector still prioritize CCS investment? How do we push for a move away from that? And it seems clear there's better uses of money. So thanks for a great analysis.
Yeah, well, about 40% of the Inflation Reduction Act is funding what I call useless technologies, such as carbon capture, direct air capture, blue hydrogen, which involves carbon capture, electrofuels, which involves carbon capture, small modular reactors, keeping existing reactors open, bioenergy. So part of that's political, and part of it is that there's just a lot of misinformation about whether they're useful or not. And then there's big agricultural, nuclear, and fossil fuel lobbyists who are pushing for them. So I think part of it is educating the people about why this is not helpful. That may sometimes, to get bills passed, they need to compromise, and that's why in a lot of cases it gets pushed. But the reason there's so much misinformation is they just focus on what's being captured. They're not actually looking at what's being emitted to capture, because there's a big energy penalty of capturing something. And there's, building pipelines, there's energy required for that. Compressing gas, CO2 into a pipeline takes energy. So when you look at the whole system, that's when you find that there's no benefit to this, especially when you compare with an alternative. So the key is to compare with alternatives, just using renewables to replace fossil sources, and to actually look at the whole system, not just what's being captured. But I think it's education is really what's needed, and just more information about why this is useless.
Right. Okay. Given where we are currently, do you feel 80% implementation is feasible or doable? What percent are we currently at? Have you seen lots of increase in wind and solar in California? However, have not seen one of water wave production. Is there currently electric production in the water wave sector in California?
Well, I think a goal of 80% by 2030 is good. Whether it'll happen or not, probably not, but it depends on the country and the sector. So if we're just looking at California, as I mentioned, we're close to 50% wind, water, solar in the electric power sector, but not for industry or electric vehicles or buildings. The US as a whole is around 21% wind, water, solar. China is around 28%. So they're even further than us, and they're going to actually they're building this year alone like 340 gigawatts of wind and solar. That's 10 times more than the US is building. The US is planning like 40 gigawatts. So there are places where there's a lot of growth, and there, as I mentioned, there are a bunch of countries, there are like 50 countries that are over 50% wind, water, solar in their electricity, but again, not all energy. It's going to take this huge push, and whether we can get there, yeah, probably not, but I think that still has to be the goal, because we can only do as good as we can do. And without that goal, it's just people are going to be even slower. Oh, and the other question was, what was it about?
It was what, wave,
the
wave water sector.
Yeah, the wave has not really taken off. So that's like, well, we only include a tiny amount, and with kind of has been the hope that it would take up, but that it's even, I mean, every time we do a plan, it's like less and less wave power. So I wouldn't rely on wave or tidal power for very much.
Have you looked at the impact of geoengineering technologies on the WWS resource?
Well, geoengineering is another false solution, because it doesn't actually solve any problem. I mean, it doesn't actually reduce any carbon dioxide emissions or air pollution emissions. It just allows those emissions to continue. And so you have this, it doesn't even attempt to address air pollution, because it's just attempting to reduce the amount of sunlight going to the surface, which has the potential to cause massive starvation worldwide, because you're reducing photosynthesis for plants or for crops. And then there's all sorts of potential side effects of, if you put the particles in the ozone layer, that can cause damage in the ozone layer. You put particles offshore of coastal areas, then those particles blow in and increase air pollution. And you have to keep doing this, and that takes energy. All it does is make people complacent that something's being done when nothing's actually being done. And, best you're going to get like a reduction of sunlight that might reduce some temperatures temporarily. But that has all sorts of side effects, as I mentioned, especially reducing photosynthesis. So I would just stay away from all geoengineering. That's we need to just focus on eliminating combustion. That's the problem.
Does the data and forecast on power demand and consumption take into account the large segment of population that still rely on bioenergy sources?
Yeah, I mean, there are about, well, maybe 750,000 people with no electricity in the world. Sorry, 750 million people with no electricity in the world. And there's probably like 1 to 2 billion people who have access to kind of bioenergy, like dung waste and biofuels. So yeah, we have plans for all these countries and communities. And it's, again, electrification. So some remote communities would use microgrids with solar batteries, but again, electrifying, because right now, most of like 40% of the deaths worldwide are from indoor pollution, from using energy, burning fuels for heating and cooking. And 20% of those deaths for indoor pollution are children under the age of 5 years old. And so just by going to electric induction cooktops, we'd eliminate half those indoor air pollution deaths. But we need to then provide the electricity with solar batteries, maybe some wind. And you could have those local microgrids. And then for heating, again, heat pumps would be the way to make it most efficient. So that requires buy-in by the countries and communities that are affected. So yeah, it's part of a social problem to actually get these technologies implemented on a large scale. And the question of who pays for it.
Right.
Okay, last question.
Okay, given that electrification will also require land to establish a distribution network, would the land requirement be at par with the existing requirement?
Well, if you're referring to the transmission distribution network, we're going to need like 2.25 times the electricity if we electrify all energy. But that gets rid of all combustion, all fossil fuels. We get rid of all pipelines, for example, all storage facilities. So we reduce land use by, the fossil fuel industry occupies 1.3% of US land. So we get rid of all that. And biofuel, corn, ethanol occupies another 1.24%. So we get rid of all that and we replace it with less land use. So yeah, there'll probably be more transmission lines. We can use some of the same lines, but increase the capacities, but we'll probably need more transmission distribution. But overall, the footprint is going to be much less than the current infrastructure.
Mark, thank you a million times for a lot of good information. There's even more questions. We've run out of time, unfortunately, but I think you really provided a lot of stimulating information. I would like to remind everybody that we do record these webinars and put them on the BDLA website in another week or so. And so you can go review this again. So again, our website is bdla.stanford.edu. And not only will this webinar be up there, but the other webinars that we've done, including one with Amory Lovins and a variety of other national and international experts, as well as some fantastic teaching tools. We only exist and survive and thrive if you guys are interacting with us, downloading the information, and also, very importantly, telling colleagues and friends about the BDLA. And that's what allows us to continue and do this exciting work. So, Mark, thank you for the work that you do and for sharing it with the group today.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Appreciate it.
Yeah. And thank you, everybody, for attending.